Redditors who have found dead bodies. What's the story? A girl that was missing for 3 days last seen drunk in a club turned up on one of the busiest beach bars midday during the summer. Turns out she decided to go night swimming. The club is by the sea as well and drowned. It was a horrible sight to see, white as a sheet, her hair flowing in the water, face down, arms away, just swaying in the water, still wearing her evening party dress. Peaceful and yet very unnerving. Worst thing was I overheard two girls mocking the drowned girl. Felt like I could hit them, but decided to bail with my wife. The morbid curiosity and the mob mentality can play tricks on your head. My so and I lived in a 2-unit apartment building a couple years ago. In the upstairs unit, downstairs was a middle-aged woman and her late teens or early 20s son. She worked overnights as a nurse, and I think he was doing college part-time or something. Not exactly sure. One morning, I'm getting out of the shower, getting ready for work, and I hear the woman downstairs screaming my so's name, crying for help. My so sleeps like the dead, so they had no idea, but I threw some shorts on and ran downstairs. The neighbor's son was face down in the middle of their hallway. I helped her flip him over so she could try mouth to mouth, but he was cold to the touch. I remember being startled by how heavily his head hit the ground when we flipped him. I called 911 while she did chest compressions and sobbed, but it was all way too late. Apparently he'd had an asthma attack and collapsed in the middle of the night. He'd been dead for hours by the time his mother got home from work and found him. Last day of school, when I was 13 or 14, went to the local park and was running around with some friends when one of us ran up and said he'd found a body. We thought he was bullshitting until he showed us. A guy had hung himself in a tree above a path, quite high up, so it must have taken some effort and he must have been there since early morning. I remember it smelled very similar to how war museums smell. Witnessed a bad car accident Christmas morning about 20 years ago. A van carrying a family crashed on 95 in Florida and apparently nobody was wearing seatbelts. Their bodies were all over the road, about 5 or 6 people. Was doing an industrial year working abroad. We formed a little community from across the different universities. My girlfriend came and told me a guy's door was open when he was meant to have flown home that morning. So I go check it out. I see a body curled up in the fetal position with a pool of blood. One touch of his skin confirmed he was gone. Onions time, it was Christmas Eve. His phone had a ton of missed calls from his mother. I was probably like 8 years old when I looked out the taxi window to see a dead guy who got squashed against a wall because of speeding. We were stuck in bad traffic a few years ago. Turns out, right before we got there was a horrible accident on the bridge we were crossing. A guy was crumpled up laying on the ground not moving. In the other lane between some oddly positioned cars, a direct motorbike a few yards away. Turns out the biker got hit from behind by a driver who was not paying attention. Flew off his bike and got hit midair by another car in the other lane. He died before he hit the ground. He wasn't wearing any protective gear either. Pretty bad car crash one time near a highway where I lived. I was near it with my mom, and I just look back and see people running around and dragging people who are close, if not are dead, to the side. Pretty traumatic. Another one was from my grandpa. He worked at a gas station in the mid-60s and one time he just saw someone jet-boned by a truck and she flew through the windshield of her car and landed on her neck. He couldn't express to me when he told it how scary it was to just see her head roll up to the door and tap the glass. My brother was a teenager when he found our dad. He was working outside in the heat and had a massive heart attack. The saddest thing in my life at that point, other than my dad dying, was my barely a teenager brother telling me he had closed our dad's eyes. My brother saw our other brother after he died in an accident. His face was very badly damaged. I keep thinking how traumatic that was. I only just realized that same brother found our dad dead in bed a month later. He died from a massive heart attack. I seem to have forgotten he was the one who found my dad. So, no wonder he has so many issues with death. I was skipping school with my buddies, and we went hiking at a nearby state park. There was a good sized rock outcropping that we were about to climb when a couple of us found a body that looked stuffed into a space between a couple boulders. He was very obviously dead. Some other hikers who were nearby heard our commotion and came over. They were on their way down and agreed to call the cops. We proceeded to climb the rocks and get high as originally planned. When I was 7, my uncle lived with me and my family. We didn't know he had a heroin problem until one day I went to get him for dinner and found him face down on the ground in his bedroom. That ducked me up for a long time. Found my uncle dead from a heroin od as well. My grandma called my father and I to check on him because he hadn't come out of his room and she was scared to check. He was hunched over on the ground next to his bed with a needle still in his arm. One of his junkie friends was there too and took the needle. He left. My dad was screaming, crying and smacking him, trying to wake him up. Grandma quietly sobbing on her couch. Cops came and were very suspicious of his positioning and the fact that there was no needle. Worst day of my life. I was working at a supermarket early one morning to get the loading dock ready for our big weekly delivery. Opened the dock door to find the car parked back there. It was a secluded area. Check the car out. There was a naked couple in the back, still in an embrace egg. Her legs were wrapped around him. They didn't look right. Kinda pale. And no response, even from rocking the car. We called the police. They broke the window to confirm they were dead. It appeared that they had left the car running for the heater, but had backed it up against the wall blocking the exhaust pipe and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Turns out they were married, just not to each other. It was a small community and word spread like wildfire. When the guy's wife showed up, she said he's lucky he's dead, otherwise I'd kill him. I was on my way to a haircut early in the morning and saw a homeless woman sleeping in the doorway of her business. I set a care package next to her and got my hair done. 2 hours later I walked past her on my way back to my car and she hadn't moved an inch. I tried talking to her, but she didn't move. When I got closer I could tell she wasn't breathing and her face did not look like she was sleeping. I called 911 and they said they'd send somebody over. It took almost an hour before a walking cop stopped by and actually checked her. I was driving to the store to pick up beer for a hockey game get-together or something, and saw a homeless guy riding his tricycle with a bunch of stuff on the front of it down a very busy highway-type road. He was riding against the traffic. On my way back there was one ambulance there as he had just been hit by a vehicle and they were in the process of putting him in a body bag. I don't remember if the person who hit him stopped or not. Pulled up anchor in boat after fishing on giant river. Felt like was pulling up a tree trunk. Got anchor to top and a decomposing body was attached. Freaked out. Let go of anchor. Pulled it up again. And body was gone. Went to my dad's apartment after a few days of no return text messages or phone calls. Walked up and saw a stack of mail and newspapers by the door and I instantly panicked. I was screaming Dad, Dad, and with one shoulder thrust I broke the door in hinges busted. I ran though the app screaming his name, hoping he would be in bed sick and would respond. He didn't. I made it to the bathroom and found him, dead, right in front of the tub. I touched him. It was clammy and cold. His face had melted into the rim of the tub. It was almost 10 years ago, but that image still haunts me. I'm just glad I found him, and not my other family members. Job site. It was 9 acres of really bad shit. Lots of tanks that had been illegally pulled and dumped on the property without being drained. So many random spots of soil contamination and all kinds of other random shit lying around that was going to make mitigation a pain in the ass. Also, there was a house on the property. It had been burned badly in a fire and had become a trap house, a place where people went to use drugs. The client really didn't want to go in, but I knew the house had to be demoed, so I had to look for asbestos and possibly based paint evidence of chipping paint to sample, so we could plan disposal. Well, client relented and we went in and found it not dead as a stone. I called EMS. It was kind of a helpless feeling. I half felt I should start CPR, but knew there was no point. Dude was long gone. EMS didn't even try narcan. We talked to the police and went on our way. I left that out of my report. On New Year's Day a few years ago, I was walking my dog. It's always a dog walker, isn't it, down by the river. Saw a weird shape in the water. At first I thought it was just a duck or something. Then I realized it was a coat. Then I realized there was a body inside the coat, floating face down. In the seconds it took me to process this, a police officer had appeared. Somebody else had seen him, just before I turned up, and called it in. I just got out of the way, and carried on with my walk. I hadn't really got a good enough look, to end up traumatized or anything like that. It transpired that he was homeless, and had either fallen or jumped into the river a couple of days earlier. Very sad. I was around 5 or 6 years old when I saw my maternal grandfather's body outside their house. My family lived next door to my grandparents in an apartment complex. He was holding a bottle of alcohol. I can't remember if it was whiskey or just beer in his hand. I found out years later that he had toxic amounts of alcohol in his system because, according to my maternal grandmother, he has been drinking all day with his friends. Because of the incident, I rarely ever go to funerals, because the mere sight of a dead body, even if it's in a coffin, reminds me of that fateful day I saw my grandpa. If ever I have to go to a funeral, I sit farthest away from the body. The incident also caused me to throw away my dreams of becoming a medical professional. I was working night shift as a carriage driver. Someone called me and said their wife might be dead. I go up, and she is just sitting on the couch, pale and cool to the touch. No pulse. I call 911 and call the family. Super awesome family. I love them all. The whole family showed up to console their father. We all chatted and shared memories. 911 came, did their thing. I did my report. An overall pleasant experience for something a little morbid. I came home from work to find my fiancé dead on the living room floor. 911 wanted me to do chest compressions, even though he was cold. I wasn't strong enough to roll him over, which ended up being a blessing. He'd been there long enough that his blood had settled to the lowest points in his body. Apparently his face was pretty gruesome. Glad that's not the last memory I have of his face. Not me, but my cousin. She was driving to work one morning when she noticed a light in front of her house that hadn't been there before. But there was something wrong with it. It didn't look like a normal light. It was shining up. She pulled over and looked closer, and could make out the shape of himself that had hit a tree and ended up with the nose up the trunk of the tree and front tires off the ground. It had been there so long that there was a covering of snow on it which was sort of filtering the headlights. That was the weird light she saw. She went over and brushed snow off the driver's window, and the driver was dead in his seat. I don't think he died in the crash. I think he crashed because he had died while driving, but I'm not sure. She didn't mention any blood. She only said how blue he was. Car crash. Truck had flipped over maybe 1 minute prior to our arrival. It had landed perfectly on top and squished the guy. His arm was still hanging out of the truck, so I checked to see if he had a pulse, but no such luck. Still warm but blood and diesel fuel everywhere. We then saw kids' toys all over the road, so we did our best to look inside, but saw no kids. I then crawled down the embankment into the woods looking for debris and possible ejected children. Police showed up 20 minutes later pretty remote, and the coroner declared him dead. Poor guy looked like he overcorrected on a curve, was only 23, and had 2 little kids he left behind. I don't think I'll ever get that image out of my head. When I was in college, I was home for summer, and out with 2 friends from high school taking a late night walk around the neighborhood. Catching up, we heard a huge crash from the main road nearby, so ran up to take a look. A car had gone into a tree at tremendous speed. There was nothing left. We found one guy in the middle of the road. His legs were missing. He was actually alive but unconscious. On the opposite sidewalk was another guy. He was folded in half, but backwards. He was dead. We recognized both immediately. They had also gone to our high school, but were a year younger. My one friend lost his shit immediately. Just sat down and started bawling. My other friend ran to our house to bang on the door to get them to call 911, as this was pre-cell phone. We stayed on the scene for a while to talk to the police. I will never forget the screams of the dead kid's mom when his parents showed up. From what we found out later, It was estimated they were both whacked out of their minds on coke and were doing over 100 in the Mustang that drive as the kid who survived but lost his legs dad had bought him 2 weeks earlier. They went into the tree at that speed without braking. The engine ended up in a backyard a few hundred feet away. The car was completely obliterated. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. Social worker. I used to do welfare checks for the earlier and senior homes. Seen lots of things, but the one that got me was an old lady who used to come to all my events in the rec room. She went into a diabetic coma because she wanted to eat the way she did. Was dead for 3 days when I went into her apartment. I was 9 at the time, walking to my mom's to visit from my grandma's, and took a trail that leads to a dirt road and then back to a gravel road. The walk isn't more than a mile or so. This little 5 or 6 year old boy was ran over on his bicycle on the dirt road. He was mangled, and I seen parts of his skull and brain scattered down the dirt road. His bike was maybe 20 feet away. I never told my grandparents or my mom. I just found one yesterday. I witnessed a car crashing into a tree after heavy rain. I had to tell the 19-year-old that his 45-year was dead and he couldn't go to the wreck because it was getting on fire. These things mess with your head. I was walking down a very crowded street in a large city. Turning down a side street, I saw some legs visible on the other side of this tree. As I passed by the tree, I glanced in the direction of the legs and saw a sprawled out man that was obviously dead. His eyes were open. There was a putrid smell, and he was laying in a position that looked incredibly unnatural to be sleeping in. I looked at him for a minute or two, trying to decide what to do. There was about 15 or 20 people within close eyesight. All were middle or old-aged men. I went up to them and pointed to the guy. They didn't get what I was trying to say, but I eventually got them to walk over to the body. When they saw what the situation was, they shrugged. One guy walked off to get somebody. Later it was explained to me that people die in the street constantly. New Delhi, India. Found a guy dead in a doorway early one morning. He looked like a drunk guy who curled up in the doorway and died. Probably froze to death as it was late December and party season. Ambulance arrived and the police turned up to take statements. Real gallows humor, but they could not get him on the stretcher as he was curled on a ball and stuck in that position. He fell off the side and I laughed. I'm going to heck. Desperate on laughter is a thing. I remember when I first discovered it was when this really old 90 years old woman didn't notice the glass door at the doctor's office reception was closed and hit it really hard. She left blood where her face hit. She then immediately fell backwards, and I was so horrified and worried. But all I could do was laugh. Not like a little giggle either, like full-blown laughing my ass off. Everyone was looking at me like I was a monster, but I really couldn't stop. A couple years later I went on a roller coaster, and same thing happened. I was scared out of my mind, and all I could do was laugh. So that made me feel like less of a horrible person. Sometimes when our brains don't know what to do, it responds with laugh. I saw someone on the ground after falling jumping from a height. I was on a city bus, reading a book, when the whole bus went all at once. So I looked up, and a homeless looking guy was rolling back and forth on the sidewalk. I wouldn't have even known he fell if someone hadn't told me. Neighbor who hasn't been seen around for a week. He was a recluse, so it wasn't surprising, but he wasn't answering his calls, so I thought I'd check on him with another neighbor. Fortunately it was wintertime, so his body didn't rot, but it was weird seeing him. He had died in his sleep. He looked so peaceful, and I thought he'd wake up at any time. While I was still living in Brussels, I took the subway daily to go places. The escalators often malfunctioned, so I wasn't expecting anything taking the stairs, only to discover a homeless woman had gotten stuck with her baggy clothes and she'd fallen backwards. Her skull was cracked open and blood was everywhere. I called an ambulance, but all credit goes to 2 young and brave men who tore her clothing away from the escalator and freed her. Tried stopping the bleeding, but it was to no avail. The most shocking thing was the amount of passers-by just ignoring the situation. Ever since that day, a broken escalator always felt a little weird. This one actually happened to my grandfather and not me. I don't know the details too well. It was around 20 years ago, I know. My grandfather was hunting alone in our little rural area here in Tennessee. He said he was looking into the trees as he was walking and wasn't paying attention to where he was stepping. He ended up actually stepping onto a badly decomposed body. He immediately looked down to see it and immediately threw up right then and there. He walked back to his car and called the police. It took them a couple of weeks to identify the body. The autopsy proved that the man had been dead for over 3 months before he was found. They identified him as a big-time drug dealer in Memphis that they had been looking for. They determined his cause of death was a gunshot to the chest. I've heard that story a few times growing up. That's about all the details I know. I have not found any body directly, but my wife and me were walking in our ancient neighborhood when I sniffed something that smelled like rotten meat, but like a lot. I told my wife it was probably a death animal. I called the police just to have a look. Turn out it was a 70-ish old man who died in his living room a few weeks ago. Not me, but my husband. He worked for a time as a reporter at a small local newspaper in the Southern California mountains. He was told to write an article about a guy who had gone camping but didn't come home when expected. The guy was still missing after a few days. My husband went out hiking in the area where the guy was last seen, trying to get some context for the story, and stumbled on the guy's campsite and his dead body. He died of natural causes. My husband never gave me details, except to say that the smell was horrible. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.